Hello and welcome. I am DEJI360. And of course, the issue of Nigeria's dwindling economy is one that is of great concern to many in the country, and it doesn't look like the situation is getting any better. The federal government last week announced that the sum of 3.36 trillion naira has been allocated for fuel subsidy in 2023 as the country's debt profile hits $102 billion. The Minister of Finance, Budget and National Planning, Zainab Ahmed, who made the announcement, explained that the proposed budget has a deficit of 10.78 trillion naira, which will be funded through domestic and multilateral borrowings as well as proceeds from privatization. Now, according to her, of Nigeria's $102 billion debt now, 35% is foreign and 65% is domestic, while the current public debt is at 23% of the country's gross domestic product. Pointing out that the 2023 budget also factored in 17.16 inflation rate, the minister clarified that the 3.36 trillion naira allocated to subsidy payment is for January to June 2023, when subsidy will be suspended. So you can imagine what the situation would be if the subsidy was to be extended till the end of the year. I mean, that would be mind-blowing. Meanwhile, Nigeria's inflation rate surged to 20.77% in September 2022, representing the highest rate since September 2005. Now, what is the implication of all of this for the ordinary Nigerian? Let's find out. Joining me on the program right now is Dr. Muda Yusuf. He is the Chief Executive Officer of the Center for the Promotion of Private Enterprise. Dr. Muda, thank you very much for joining us on the program. Let me start by getting your take on the breakdown that the minister gave just last week when, she broke down the budget and then, clearly made it, made it known that we're going to spend 3.36 trillion naira on petrol subsidy in 2023, and that's just for the first half of the year, 2023.
Yes, it's a very disturbing outlook for the macroeconomic environment, for the investment environment, and ultimately for the welfare of the people. Because the way it is, this budget has a provision for debt service of about 6.3 trillion. The revenue is just about 9.7 trillion. So when you relate that revenue to debt service, you can imagine what will be left. And in any case, by the time you discount even the revenue, because the chances are that we cannot make 100% of the revenue.
Absolutely.
So if you discount it by, say, maybe 30%, which has been the record or the trend over time, you'll be left with just over 6 trillion. So in practical terms, what we have committed to debt service, which is a first-line charge, is not negotiable, we almost practically offset the revenue. So we are dealing with a budget scenario where the entirety of the budget, that is budget for funding the personnel costs, the overhead, and the capital project will be funded from borrowing. That is the scenario. And now we are looking at a deficit of over 10 trillion. That is on the assumption that subsidy will end, by the middle of next year. And just as you said in your intro, from the vibes we are getting from the National Assembly, it may not end by the middle of next year. So we are looking at a much bigger deficit scenario, a much bigger debt scenario. So it's really a very disturbing outlook.
Let me ask you this. Of course, you're quite right. The vibes we're getting from the National Assembly is that subsidy may not end. But when you consider the implication, and the Minister of Finance did talk about it some time ago, what the implication of extending the subsidy to the end of 2023, what the implication would be. I think at some point she made it very clear that the country may probably be left with nothing other than maybe somewhere in the region of, is it 5 billion or so? I'm just wondering, what exactly do you think the National Assembly could be looking at? Where is the National Assembly expecting that money would come from if it is not too willing to do away with the subsidy?
Well, it's not a matter of not being willing. It's a matter of being pragmatic, and it's also a matter of being fair to the incoming administration. You cannot come into government from day one and suddenly remove the entirety, the total subsidy. It is almost impractical. It's a different thing if we don't have a very wide margin between what the current prices are and what the landing cost is supposed to be. Because for as long as oil price remains at this level, 90, 100, 80, 85, if we want to remove subsidy entirely, you'll be talking of pump price of between 400 to 500.
But then the government expects that the refineries will be up and running. If you can hear me, Dr. Yusuf, the government expects that the refineries, will be up and running, that somehow around that period, before that time too, the Dangote refinery may be up and running as well. So this issue of landing cost may actually not be a serious factor anymore. And even the CBN governor did express the optimism that, look, the Dangote refinery will be up before June, and that the refineries we're rehabilitating at the moment will also be up, and that if they all come into operation, there'll be no need importing petrol anymore.
That is an assumption. So we'll be lucky if those assumptions turn out to be valid assumptions. Mm-hmm. If the assumptions come out to be valid, if they come out to, if it comes out like that, that is fine. That will create the room for us to, get around this subsidy problem. But that proviso has to be there, even in the presentation of the budget. This is not to say that it is good for this subsidy to continue. It is not sustainable. Mm. But again, when you are managing an economy, you are more or less also managing human beings.
It's a tough choice.
It's a tough choice. You have to balance the social considerations, the commercial considerations, the political considerations, and even the economic considerations. Because this is about governance. So it's not a straight line commercial or economic, conversation that should be. My take is that, we pray that the refineries will come on board. We pray that the Dangote refinery will also come on. If that happens, fine. We may have a slight review, more than what the current price is, because the fact that we are producing locally does not mean that we should be buying fuel at the current price. But by the time the subsidy is removed, the gap will not be too significant. The shock on the system, the shock on the citizens will not be too profound. I'm emphasizing the social point because of the current level of pain, anguish, and poverty in the land. Look at what is happening to food inflation. For many families now, they spend almost 70% of family budget on food. So these are the considerations that we should put alongside. From a purely economic point of view, we should have removed the subsidy yesterday.
But obviously this is obviously beyond economics. It's obviously beyond the theory of economics. You're talking reality here.
Of course, that is what it should be. So if you have to remove it, that is if this refinery don't come on board, it has to be a phased thing. And we also get the buy-in. We are hoping that when we have a new government, the trust level will be higher. So it will be easier to call on the citizens to make some sacrifices. But not that in one fell swoop, you move from 170 or 175 to almost 400. That will be extremely difficult.
Let's talk about the debt profile of the country, $102 billion. And of course, quite a number of people have been shouting about the debt profile of the country. But the question is, you look at the revenue side of things, we're not doing too well. So without borrowing, what alternative does the government have?
Well, dealing with the debt, this is something that is cumulative. Now, as at I think June or so, the public debt was about 42 or 43 trillion. About 12% of that belongs to the states. The balance is to the federal government. Now, we have not reckoned with government indebtedness to the central bank, which is also sovereign debt. The minister is now talking about converting it into bond and all of that. By the time you add almost 20 trillion to that, you're talking about 62 trillion. Then you have the debts that the AMCON debt. By the time you add that, you'll be getting close to almost 70 trillion. So the debt situation is extremely, extremely, very, very bad. But the options we have, of course, in this situation, we have very limited options. But this matter is a matter that we need to deal with, both from the expenditure side and from the revenue side. If we're able to ease our way out of this subsidy, the challenge of managing the debt will be much less.
You're quite right.
Because you have a much better fiscal space, to be able to manage the situation. If you're able to get a government that can cut down on the cost of governance, because cost of governance is also a very big factor. In spite of all the challenges of revenue, expenditure has been ballooning over the years. So we need to rein in on the cost of governance. Then, of course, we have all these issues around the fiscal leakages. We have seen all this series of reports by the Auditor General, which nobody is taking seriously. So there has to be a lot more accountability. And we also need to look at the budget, look at the assumptions in the budget. The exchange rate assumption, put the exchange rate assumption at 435 naira to the dollar.
As we speak at the moment, the exchange rate at the exporter and importer window is far higher than that. It's in the region of 440,
yes.
Not to mention what the parallel market rate is.
The parallel market. So why will you go and put a 435 in the budget? And this is going through everybody and nobody is raising any questions about it. At least at the minimum, it should be putting that exchange rate as close to 500. At least you get some revenue from that. You don't have to begin to create a subsidy regime, even right inside the budget assumptions. So these are some of the things. And of course, if we're able to create the right policy environment, we are likely to witness a growth in investment. Because right now, some of our policies are also not encouraging private investment. They are not encouraging the inflow of private capital into the economy. If you have a much more conducive environment, if investment level is growing, revenue to government will also grow. There's a positive correlation between the growth of investment, the performance of business, and also the revenue that accrues to government. So we should have that kind of holistic mindset or holistic view of the performance of the economy, the performance of the private sector, and the growth of revenue to government. All of these things are interrelated.
How challenging do you think it will be for the next government? Because, look, whether we like it or not, there will be another government next year. And of course, we would expect that the government, even though this government is preparing a budget now for 2023, there's just no way that the new government would not tinker with that budget. We might see some form of budget now, maybe around the middle of the year or so when the new government comes in. But no doubt, you look at the current economic challenges, you look at the crisis, the food crisis that is likely to result, especially from the ongoing flooding in the country at the moment. You want to say that the next government is just not going to have things easy at all?
No, it's not going to be easy. And that is why it is important for the candidates to also manage expectations.
Exactly.
Because, people are promising, heaven and earth, But the reality on the ground points to the fact that it's going to be a very challenging period economically. So from the financial point of view, it's going to be very challenging. It's going to be very difficult. But I believe that because managing the economy is not only about revenue and spending, it's also about policies. If you have the right kind of policies, we can moderate some of these pains, some of these challenges that businesses are facing, that the citizens are also facing. We can tinker with some of the policies around our foreign exchange policy, for instance, around our trade policy, around our monetary policy, around our investment policy. If you tinker with some of those things, you could bring some succor to the people. It's not everything that is about appropriation. There are ways you can create a policy environment that will allow some relief to come in, that will allow private capital to come in, both from within and from outside the economy. So these are the various options that we should be looking at. And we also need to be more creative about revenue. The minister was suggesting the issue of equity investment from some idle assets and all of that. These are some of the creative ways that you can bring in, to ease the situation going forward. So we should not just be boxed into all this rigid revenue framework. We should be looking at how we can attract a lot more investment and how we can get the government to pull out of some areas that the private sector can handle, so that the burden of expenditure on the government will be much less.
All right, Dr. Yusuf, well, thank you very much for joining us on the program, and thank you for your contributions.
Thank you very much, DEJI.
Thank you so very much. Well, we'll take a short break now, and we'll be right back. Don't go away.
Opinions are free, facts are sacred, but truth is universal.
How, in practical terms, can we, for instance, de-escalate the tension?
President must see himself as the President of the Federal Republic.
We know where the enemy is. 3 places. The Lake Chad Basin, the border area between Nigeria and Cameroon, and then the Sambisa Forest.
On DEJI360, we give you a complete dose of everything. Opinion, facts, and undiluted truth.
I hardly believe what politicians say in this part of the world.
A new Nigeria is possible, a future is possible.
We delve into the issues, dissect it so that you can understand it, use it to take action.
I don't think there's any need for any governor to look for grant for ranching.
DEJI360, dissecting the issues.